Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the pain at the pump with gas at $6 a gallon in California as oil prices continue to rise, impacting India, Asia, and Europe in particular, with Russia the only winner so far. We will discuss how Trump's war of choice is rattling allies in Europe and infuriating allies in the Gulf who are getting pounded by Iran. Joining us is Emma Ashford, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, a visiting professor at Georgetown University, and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. With expertise in the politics of the Middle East, Russia, Europe, her work focuses on questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. She's the author of First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World, and Oil, the State and War, the Foreign Policies of Petrostates. And she has an article at the Financial Times we will discuss. America has become an agent of chaos in world energy markets. Then, following a classified briefing on Thursday, at which senators were told that the Trump White House had not considered the possibility of Iran closing the Straits of Hormuz, Senator Murphy expressed sympathy for the U.S. military because, quote, they are being given orders by a senile old man who is losing his mind. Joining us to assess Trump's mental acuity is Dr. Alan Francis, a professor emeritus and former chair of psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis, and his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity. A psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. Then finally, we look into whether Trump will be able to rig the next election by pushing through the Save America Act, which is designed to disenfranchise half of the electorate who don't have passports and 9% who don't have the paperwork to prove they are American citizens, as well as married women whose name on the birth certificate is different from their married name. Joining us to assess whether the Republicans in the Senate will hold the line against pressure from their own party, who expect an electoral wipeout in November, is Justin Levitt, professor of law at Loyola Marymount University and a nationally recognized scholar of constitutional law and the law of democracy. He recently served as the White House's first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights, where he assisted President Biden to restore trust in a democracy. He previously served in the federal government as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and has been invited to testify before committees of the U.S. House and Senate, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, several state legislative bodies, and both federal and state courts. And before we begin, with Trump having bombed 7 countries and started a war against Iran, while at home his ICE thugs terrorize and break up families, murdering American citizens in the process, the need to rid the country of the deeply unpopular Trump cacistocracy and his clown car cabinet could not be more urgent. But these crooks and criminals would do anything to stay in power as their billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media and the mob boss intimidates Republican politicians. Only people power can beat money power, and we need all hands on deck as we continue to do our part, delivering a daily public service, providing the facts and evidence to inform the majority of what they are up against and how to win back our country, our decency, and the respect of the community of nations. You can help save America's 250-year-old democracy by making a tax-deductible donation at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org, and thank you. And joining us now is Emma Ashford, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, a visiting professor at Georgetown University, and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. And she has an article at the Financial Times, America has become an agent of chaos in world energy markets. Welcome to Background Briefing, Emma Ashford.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And President Trump announced that the U.S. military had obliterated military targets on Kharg Island, which is a small island where 90% of Iran's oil exports originate. Trump said for reasons of decency, they didn't attack the oil facilities, but they nevertheless obliterated all the other targets. We've heard the use of obliterated before, and it's not proven to be particularly accurate. What do you think the status of this war is at this moment?
I think the announcement about Cork Island is just another case of the brinksmanship that we're increasingly seeing from both sides. Cork Island is important, not perhaps essential to Iran's oil exports. World markets would not like it if that oil infrastructure was destroyed. So Trump appears to have settled on, he blew up the military airstrip on the island instead and then threatened to do more. We've seen the Iranians react by targeting Fujairah port in the United Arab Emirates. And this is what we just keep seeing happening is both sides trying to force the other to back down with increasingly aggressive and damaging attacks, particularly on oil infrastructure. And if this doesn't stop at some point, we're already seeing significant impacts in markets, but it's only going to get worse.
Well, what's extraordinary, and I think it's pretty clear, is that the U.S. administration, the Trump administration, does not have a normal national security process. They have a national security advisor who's also Secretary of State. They've thinned out the national security staff, and the national security briefers from the Trump administration who briefed senators last Thursday apparently alarmed everybody by revealing that they hadn't really thought about the possibility of the Iranians closing the Straits of Hormuz. And this led, for example, Senator Chris Murphy to say that he feels sorry for the U.S. military because, quote, they are being given directions by a senile old man who is losing his mind. I mean, we haven't ever heard anything like that in the recent wars that this country has been engaged in. This seems to me to be a five-alarm fire.
I mean, certainly it is not a good situation. I am not entirely sure that the notion that the military didn't consider the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, I don't think that's credible, quite frankly. This is something that, as somebody who teaches courses on oil and security, this is something we teach undergrads about the possibility of. So this is a very commonly known, and the US military has had plans for it for years. I think what we're seeing, though, is there was reporting late on Friday that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, did brief Donald Trump on the possibility of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and the president didn't necessarily believe him. Now, this can happen with any policymaker. We've seen policymakers in recent decades and much further ago make very bad decisions against advice. But it does seem that in this conflict in particular, President Trump is just disregarding most of the military advice from those around him.
Well, he keeps saying that the straits are open, and that the problem is that the tanker captains and crews aren't showing any guts.
I mean, it's true that nothing has actually blocked the straits. There was actually a debate in the academic literature about this years ago about whether you could mine the whole strait or sink ships or something. But the fact that tankers that go through the straits are facing immediate missile or drone attacks, many of which end up causing big fires, the crews have to evacuate, some of them die. I mean, that's not a situation in which either the crews or their insurers or their owners are incentivized to try and run this narrow passage until the risk is gone or the price rises just so high that that risk becomes worth it. Tankers are not going to start moving again.
So, Emma Asher, when you say the U.S. military has planned for this, and obviously they have, I was referring to the National Security Council people as opposed to the military briefers. But nevertheless, at this point, you would assume that for decades on the Iranian side, they'd also been preparing for this. And even if the U.S. has sunk the Iranian Navy ships, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, have their own Navy, and they have small boats that could cause a lot of mischief. And they apparently have a lot of mines, and a lot of their offensive equipment, missiles, etc., are buried in caves. So is that why the U.S. is sending Marines there? Is that what that scenario is about? In other words, they're going to have to land there to root out IRGC emplacements?
I sincerely hope not. That would be an incredibly dangerous mission for those Marines. They would have to land under fire, they would have to hold territory, and then probably they would have to expand further into the interior of Iran simply to protect themselves from attacks. That would be incredibly dangerous. What all of the scenarios that the energy experts and risk analysis folks have always looked at have suggested that in a situation like this, Iran can continue harassing shipping going for quite some time. And that while the US and others might be able to do some things to keep the strait open, it's going to be challenging to do so, and it's probably going to take months at best. If we think about the tanker war that was part of the Iran-Iraq war during the 1980s, was a period of several years where the US was engaged in reflagging tankers under the US flag, escorting them through the strait under fire. There were hundreds of missile strikes on boats at that time, and back in the 80s, the drone threat was not there. So this is not something that one can solve quickly or easily with the application of force.
So let's talk a little bit about your article at the Financial Times, Emma Ashford. America has become an agent of chaos in world energy markets. At this point, it seems that Russia is the only winner. The Chinese, the Indians, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, they're all suffering shortages because they get most of their oil from the Gulf. Europe also is prices are rising there, and particularly with LNG, which is no longer coming out of Qatar. So they're hurting. Even, for example, Australia, which has surprised me, they apparently get all of their jet fuel from China, and they're going to run out of jet fuel within weeks. So it's all across the world. It's being impacted. And here, of course, in California, gasoline's about $6 a gallon across the board here. So the U.S. consumer is also getting hit. Am I right in suggesting that there are no winners except perhaps Russia?
Russia will be a winner in the short term in that they'll see higher prices for their oil and gas, but even they will not in the long term benefit significantly from this. The fundamental problem is the oil market is a very globalized market. And markets for other things like jet fuel that are derivatives of oil, these are all traded on a global level. So even if it is consumers in Asia that see maybe a physical disruption, right, that the ships aren't arriving, the price is going to go up everywhere because everybody's suddenly trying to obtain these very scarce cargoes. It's classic supply and demand from Econ 101. And you're right that the US consumer is already feeling the pinch at the pump. Prices are up on average 50 or 60 cents a gallon just in the last 3 weeks. And that's going to continue as we go, because that is then upstream of prices for things like diesel, which is what we use to carry goods around the country. We're going to start seeing prices in foodstuffs and everything else go up. So yeah, this is something that is going to be felt by people all over the world.
But wouldn't the American oil companies be getting a windfall? Because prior to this war, the cost to getting oil to the market here in the United States, because the U.S. is the world's #1 producer, that hasn't changed at all. In other words, the premium extra that we are paying for the global situation, the global price of oil, means that the American oil producers are making out like bandits because their costs are the same, but their profits are enormous.
Any producer whose fuels are not trapped in the Gulf behind the strait is going to see higher prices because of this, whether it's the Russians, whether it's American shale producers in, North Dakota. But at the end of the day, the American economy is probably going to take much more of a hit than a benefit, right? Those are concentrated benefits in one specific sector of the economy. And then the costs are going to be spread across everybody in the country who uses fuel, who uses food, who uses heating. And so at the end of the day, this is why markets are so worried. And this is why we're seeing such turmoil in the financial markets, is because the hit to the US economy is almost certainly going to be larger than any benefit.
So do you think that this is the one thing that's weighing on Trump? Because I'm not sure where he's getting his advice from. The assumption is that it's probably Jared Kushner and Witkoff, who are close to Netanyahu, who got him into this war. Secretary of State Marco Rubio made a statement early in the war that, in effect, that Israel had dragged us into this war. So it's hard to know who's in charge or who's got the president's ear. But what do you expect to happen here? Because he does pay attention to the market. That's pretty clear, isn't it?
Something that's interesting about this crisis is you're absolutely right. President Trump is normally very responsive to markets. We've seen this with his tariffs policy, where they increase the tariffs, the markets freak out, and he often backs away from those or changes them subtly to minimize the market disruption. Here, the president does seem very much to be pushing forward with this and to sort of be railing against markets that it's really not a big deal, that it's going to be short-term pain for long-term gain in terms of, we will improve things in Iran. But I don't think this is a sustainable argument for him. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a war of choice. As you say, there's a lot of evidence that a few folks, particularly Lindsey Graham, around President Trump, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, have really been pushing for this, even if everybody else in the cabinet has been very reticent. And Benjamin Netanyahu has also been really active in pushing the president towards this. But at some point, the fact that nobody else benefits from this, that the costs are starting to be felt so widely in the United States, I do think the president is going to have to find an off-ramp and a way to sort of save face and try and call this thing to a close.
Well, I was struck by the fact that Hamas had criticized Iran, which is largely its sponsor, because of the damage being done to the Gulf countries. Obviously, they get a lot of support from Qatar. But nevertheless, the question arises, surely, that after the massive investments that the Gulf countries have made in buying U.S. weaponry, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc., Bahrain, they're getting pounded, and they didn't bring this war on themselves. They didn't welcome it. They're not behind it, but they're suffering the consequences. My understanding is that they're not really happy with the United States.
No, the Gulf states are in a very difficult situation right now. If they were to join the conflict and push back against Iran, it would probably only increase the risk to themselves and their citizens. But otherwise, they look like they're backing the United States. And as you say, these countries have long been engaged in sort of trying to get more US security guarantees. They buy a lot of US weapons. But what we've seen in this conflict is that, they're running out of interceptors. They're suffering these regular attacks on their civilian infrastructure. Dubai Airport, for example, major hub transiting between Europe and Asia and the Indian subcontinent, has been closed for weeks. And the financial cost to these countries is just absolutely huge. And the US is not providing any particularly significant help, right? We're still providing a lot of air defense coverage over Israel, less so over the Gulf states, unless it's our own bases. And I do think that after all of this is done in 6 months, a year or more, we might start to see, we're going to see these countries questioning, I think, whether doubling down on the US is really the right choice here, since the US effectively dragged them into this conflict.
Well, I imagine the Gulf potentates who gave billions to Jared Kushner and to the Trump family via crypto, they must be wondering what kind of investment that was.
Certainly does not seem like a good investment at the moment. I think more broadly, though, on a geopolitical level, we're seeing the same phenomenon repeated across the world. There's always been this assumption, and indeed US policymakers have often stated it themselves, that America is a source of stability for global markets, particularly for global flows of oil. We have multiple times gone to war to effectively defend world oil prices, the Gulf War in 1991, for example, and yet here we are, most of our allies don't want this. Most of the rest of the world doesn't want this, but it's the United States that has made the choice to start this war, which had the possibility to create such chaos in markets. I think that's going to have some long-term implications for how the world thinks about the United States.
And just in closing, Emma, it's not just oil, it's LNG and it's fertilizer as well, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of pain being felt, not just in terms of energy, but across the board because of the Gulf. And the Gulf requires, 90% of their food comes in. And there's also a lot of transshipment going on there that, it's a hub, as you point out. So there are many, many consequences above and beyond energy, as far as I can see.
Lots of commodities come out of the Gulf, many of them for the obvious reason that they are sort of co-located with oil and gas production. So fertilizer that you mentioned is one where it has to be located close to gas wells because that's part of how it's produced. But it's spring in much of the world right now. Farmers are planting. If fertilizer can't get to markets, then that will have implications not tomorrow, but it will have implications in 6 to 9 months when the crop is harvested. And then there's a variety of other commodities, everything from helium to, various petrochemical compounds that are needed for different kinds of manufacturing that are starting to become more scarce around the world. So oil is sort of the big indicator. It's the one that markets freak out about. But again, the longer this goes, the more we're going to see supply disruptions in all kinds of areas.
Well, Emma Ashford, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Emma Ashford, who's a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, a visiting professor at Georgetown University, and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. With expertise in the politics of the Middle East, Russia, Europe, her work focuses on questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. And she's the author of First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World, and Oil, the State, and War, the Foreign Policies of Petrostates. And she has an article at the Financial Times, America has become an agent of chaos in world energy markets. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking into Senator Murphy's remark after a disastrous briefing from the White House that the U.S. military are being given orders by a senile old man who is losing his mind.
The element heats the air, but it's still damp, cold and bare. You must wear another layer in the shadow of an empire. The factory lathe can be heard in the arcade by stall owners who trade. Every grain must be weighed in the shadow of an empire.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Dr. Alan Francis, who's a professor emeritus and former chair of psychiatry and behavioral science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity. A psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Alan Francis.
Ian, always my pleasure to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us, Alan. There was a briefing at the Senate, a classified briefing last Thursday, where White House National Security Council officials briefed U.S. senators and apparently left them extremely unsettled because apparently the White House had not considered the possibility that the Iranians would close the Straits of Hormuz and that oil prices would spike globally. This led Senator Murphy to say after the briefing that he feels sorry for the U.S. military because, quote, they are being given directions by a senile old man who is losing his mind. So, I mean, this is really serious, isn't it? When a U.S. senator diagnoses the president as losing his mind, it's not as if there hasn't been a lot of other supporting evidence as well. Do you think that this is the moment for the American people and our politicians to start talking seriously about the 25th Amendment?
Not at all. Trump never had a mind. So the behavior he's displaying now is not some new pathological phenomenon. It's Trump being Trump, given the power and the lack of guardrails to do and say exactly what he wants. I think that the lack of reality in everything he does, the disastrous consequences that we will experience are absolutely mind-boggling. But it's more the result of his being a lifetime liar, trickster, con man, crook, than of any sudden deterioration. We're seeing the pure Trump now, not some degraded version.
So that would then explain the magical thinking, because when you go back to COVID, remember that was the first crisis that he faced. He simply didn't deal with it. You have the leader of the country, you've got a crisis on your hands, and he pretends it's not happening. He talks about it's all going to go away, it'll be over soon, and then he got into diagnosing us by drinking bleach and shining UV lights inside our bodies. Total disaster, and 1 million people died unnecessarily because the President of the United States could not deal with reality. Is that what's happening now? He started a war, it's not going well, and he simply can't deal with reality.
Yep. I mean, I think when you think about it, his whole career has been creating disasters and finagling ways out of them by developing a fantasy world that he somehow imposes on others. And now he can do that to the whole world. What he was able to do to New York banks when his real estate investment 6 times turned out terribly, he's now doing to the country and to the world. But it's much more a function of him having the mind of a 2-year-old, spoiled brat, who's constantly having a temper tantrum and always gets what he wants as a result of the temper tantrum. It's not that this is him suddenly becoming crazy. It's him doing what he's done his whole life, shaping reality into distorted forms that are unrecognizable to anyone rational. But somehow, despite the COVID disaster, he's president again. He has a way of tricking people that befuddles you and I who see through him in 10 seconds. But he has a way of tricking people so that his lies, his making up stories, his complete distortion of reality works for him. It's a disaster for the world, but it works for Donald Trump.
So why are these billionaires backing him, and they're buying up the media to become propaganda organs to keep the American people from realizing and recognizing the reality of this wrecking crew led by this insane, senile man?
The tech billionaires who now control our country are Dr. Frankensteins of incredible grandiosity, self-belief, selfishness, disregard for the impact they're having on others. And they're driven by fantasies and now realities of power, unlimited power, glory, immortality, and we'll get to Mars. And Trump is a convenient vehicle for their worst ambitions. What's also happening with this terrible consolidation in the media, ownership by the worst people, is that Trump is now living in an echo chamber so that his fantasies turn into reality when he watches Fox News, which he apparently does hours a day. The media is not correcting him. Some are, but who listens? The media is, at least the media he supports, the media he watches, the media that his MAGA supporters watch, is an echo chamber echoing back to him the weirdest notions as if it's everyday reality. And he's created an echo chamber within the cabinet, in the Senate and the House of Representatives, in the Supreme Court. He has the whole world twisted into accepting his ridiculous notions as if they were just common sense. So that his inability to face reality is partly the result that reality never slaps him in the face. That as far as he's concerned, the world is as Fox News broadcasters depict it, and they depict it in just the way that he imagines it. So it's a vicious cycle of unreality and denial. And the payment for this will not come from Trump, will not come from the billionaires. They'll do fine. The payment is the ordinary guy on the street, you and me, the person, and even worse, the people who are being bombed, the people who are living in conditions of horrible, extreme climate disasters. The people who are victimized by this are not the people who are creating it. The people who are creating it do just fine, no matter how crazy the whole thing is.
So does that mean that the only thing that we have, to help us out of this quagmire that we're barreling into in the Gulf is this dreadful regime in Iran? Are they the only ones that are going to pull him over? If nobody else,
It really is. It's a heartbreaking disaster for any responsible person to hope for people to suffer. But it is a weird kind of situation we're in, that unless he's defeated and unless the cause that he represents, but more importantly, unless they're defeated, the world is going up in smoke. And there's who wants to root for this war lasting one extra day? On the other hand, if it takes high oil prices to get Trump contained, to put guardrails on what he's doing, to prevent even more terrible decisions in the future, I think that it's reasonable to hope that this drags on long enough so that it's the breaking point for him and that people begin to realize that he's driving us off a cliff.
but there's no escape, even if he finds a way to declare victory and get out of this mess, because it's obviously the repercussions will be terrible for the US. Already the only winner so far is Russia, and that's really bad news for Ukraine and Europe. And it would seem that after this is over, the Gulf and the Saudis are going to be furious that Trump brought all this destruction on them. Israel is going to get blamed. It's a total catastrophe. But guess who might well be the winner here? The tech bros' little puppet, J.D. Vance. Are we going to go out of the frying pan into the fire?
There's a real risk. I think that Rubio turned out to be a kind of Sunday soldier who's finally had a chance to create wars all over the world. And he'll be blamed for this disaster. Trump will try to do with him what he did with Kristi Noem on Homeland. He'll say it was Rubio's idea, wash his hands, but I never knew we were bombing Iran. I think it does very much strengthen Vance. I'm not at all a heartless person. I feel for everyone who suffers from this. It's a heartbreaking thing every day to read the newspaper. But I'd much rather have the disasters happen now than after the election, because after the election, they'll have a mandate, in their view, just to tear apart the Constitution and our democracy. So I'd rather have the pain happen now. And I'm hoping that people wise up so that Vance can't escape the blame for what's been an absolute disaster by saying, well, I told you not to do it. He's been part and parcel of this administration. And I hope that there's going to be the kind of disgust and turnaround that's occurred often in American history when people finally wise up to the fact that the people in power do not care about them. I'm hoping it's the kind of change that happened between Hoover and Roosevelt when the Depression made clear, I don't want us to have a depression, but I'd like us to have enough pain before an election, just enough, not too much, to get rid of the feeling that it's okay for us to be destroying our Constitution. It's okay for us to be starting wars all over the world. It's okay for us to destroy the environment. Trump just closed down the part of the government that predicts the future of climate because it's alarmist and it gives bad news. We want to drill, baby, drill. We want to stop all alternative energy resources. We want to start wars that are very bad for the environment. And so he's leading us into an absolute existential human disaster for our species. It could be a terrible die-off in the future. We have to stop that now, and nothing seems to work to stop it so far, however silly. It has to be that something bad enough happens between now and the election to wise us up, open our eyes, and I hope it's not too serious, but I hope serious enough to turn the population against Trump and get us back on being the country we're supposed to be.
Well, Trump's plan to avoid accountability for his disastrous misrule is the Save America Act. We're going to be speaking about it in the next segment. You know, this is a guy that already tried to steal an election, mounted a coup against the government, against the House and Senate, and has laid the groundwork for saying that all the elections are rigged except the ones that he wins. And what worries me is that, again, he's clever in a feral kind of way. He's casting this whole thing as, you know, well, let's just have IDs when we vote, so we know who's voting. And that sounds reasonable. And the fact that the guy got reelected after the disastrous first term indicates that there are an awful lot of people out here in the country who simply don't deal with reality or get subject to Fox News propaganda. So this is the next battle, as far as I can tell, because the Republicans all have a dog in this fight. They know that they're going to get wiped out in November. So they're going to go along with the idea of this crooked Save America Act, which is entirely designed to disenfranchise Democrats.
The Save America Act is the kind of doomsday machine of the death of democracy. And it is so extreme, it would disenfranchise many millions of Americans. It's the kind of thing where a woman might have to have her birth certificate if she changed her name when she got married. It'll make it very difficult for many people to get to the registration and to the voting stations. It will absolutely, and Trump says it out loud, it says it will guarantee a Republican majority for the next 50 years. And if anything in the world should terrify your listeners, imagine a Republican majority for the next 50 years. And that's exactly what he intends to do. Fortunately, so far, the Senate won't buy it. And at least for now, it looks like it doesn't have much of a chance to make it before the next election. But as you say, as oil prices get to $5 a gallon, $4 a gallon, it's already over $5 in California, I think that they may get more and more desperate and see this as the only way of preserving their very well-timed, very clever, rapid transformation of America from a democracy into an autocracy.
So I keep wondering, what's the wake-up? I mean, there have been so many wake-ups here. At what point do we get a critical mass of Americans recognizing the reality of what you're talking about, Al? And that is that we talked about fascism around the corner. Well, now fascism is slapping us in the face.
I think there are only three things that can happen that will save us. It won't be people suddenly saying, oh, we were wrong, waking up one morning and turning off Fox News. I think that sticker shock that's happening with gasoline, it's going to reverberate very soon to every single product because stuff has to be trucked. That requires gasoline. Oil is involved in the production of many of our products. The tariffs are making things worse. Sticker shock, really jump in inflation, a sudden jump in inflation. The second is job loss, that we produced almost no jobs in this whole first Trump year. And this could be the year in which there's sudden job loss, especially combining the federal layoffs, business uncertainty, and now AI taking over many white-collar positions, not just in tech, but throughout the economy. And the third thing, I think, is disgust with the war. I think that even his supporters, they may not switch parties, but maybe they'll stay at home because of disgust at the war. And the fourth thing would be the stock market, which so far has not responded much to all these uncertainties. The economy is very fragile. Our debt is ridiculously large. Private lending has resulted in the exact same conditions as we've had in prior financial shocks. I think that there will definitely be terrible shocks to this country. Hopefully they happen before the election so that we can be saved from having even worse ones in the future.
Well, just in closing, one of the Silicon Valley tech bros pointed out that AI will be good for the Republicans because it will get rid of professional jobs like lawyers, etc., which tend to have educated women, and they tend to vote Democrat. Whereas, the only people that will have jobs will be the working class, high school educated men. So that is a possible scenario for AI.
And our country's not having the basic existential discussions. Do we want to have a country in which 9 out of 10 workers can be replaced? What's going to happen to them? Is it a really good idea for us to be building all these data centers, which are going to absolutely destroy our environment even worse than we're doing it otherwise? There's no public discussion about whether, as a species, we're committing suicide and whether this is the best future for humanity.
Well, Dr. Alan Francis, on that cheery note, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Well, thank you. Always a pleasure, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Alan Francis, who's Professor Emeritus and former Chair of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at Duke University. He's the author of the award-winning international bestseller Saving Normal and the reference work Essentials of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And his latest book is Twilight of American Sanity. A psychiatrist analyzes the age of Trump, now out in an updated paperback version. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into whether Trump will be able to rig the next election by pushing through the Save America Act. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now, Justin Levitt, a professor of law at Loyola Marymount University and a nationally recognized scholar of constitutional law and the law of democracy. He recently served as the White House's first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights, where he assisted President Biden to restore trust in a democracy. He previously served in the federal government as the Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and has been invited to testify before committees of the U.S. House and Senate, the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, several state legislative bodies, and both federal and state courts. Welcome to Background Briefing, Justin Levitt.
Thank you so very much. It's great to be back with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And as Trump becomes more unpopular and this war on Iran looks like a quagmire, and we're paying $6 a gallon for gasoline here in California, one would assume that Trump and the Republicans are in big trouble in the November elections, and polls indicate that that is the case. But it seems that their lifeline is Trump's plans to rig the elections through the Save America Act, which he's buffaloing through the House and now trying to put the squeeze on the Senate. Some senators are holding fast, but there's a lot of pressure on them, and I guess there's a lot of pressure on the Republicans who see this as their life raft. So how is this thing going to play out?
I don't think that the legislation has much of a chance in Congress. I think it passed the House because they knew it wouldn't pass the Senate. I think you've heard a few people, like Senator Cornyn, express his preference for getting rid of the filibuster because he knows that there aren't enough votes in the Senate to actually make that happen. And all of that is because I think that the president doesn't know this, but I think that members of Congress know this bill isn't a lifeline. It's a disaster for them and for their constituents. They like having the issue. They like demagoguing about it. They like talking about it. But this bill would actually radically restructure the voter registration system in a way that actually hurts their constituents too. And I don't think any of them want this. So I think what you're watching is a fair bit of political theater, but I don't anticipate this bill is going to pass.
So in Cornyn's case, of course, he's vying to get Trump's endorsement for his Senate race against James Tallarico, right? And that's pretty transparent why he's taking that position, having been a champion to protect the filibuster for a long time, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. This is a very sudden conversion from him, and I don't think it's actually a conversion. As mentioned, I think he is desperately trying to get Trump's endorsement. He's in a very tight race, a runoff, in fact, with Ken Paxton for the Senate seat in Texas. He wants every advantage he can get, and if that means pretending to go along with the boss, he will more than happily pretend to go along with the boss. I think if you asked him about his actual preference, he'd much rather keep the filibuster. He said that repeatedly. And I think, again, I think he's taking this position now because he knows that there isn't enough support among his colleagues to actually make that happen. If you recall, Democrats were in this very position in 2022 and actually had the support of 48 members of the Senate to kill the filibuster came just too shy, Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin. The fact that one or two or three Republican senators say they're willing to do away with the filibuster isn't anywhere near enough. They need 50, and I don't think they've got it.
So, Justin, is that to say then that Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin were visionaries?
From my perspective, I'd have it the other way around. I wish they would have been a little more visionary. I think that the part of the reason that the Republican senators don't like doing away with the filibuster is they know that it would make the Senate more responsive to popular opinion, and I think that favors progressive views more often than not. I think that had Sinema and Manchin understood the stakes, that we'd be better off for a different Senate in 2022. I don't want to say that would have driven partisan results. I think it would have made voting actually better and easier for Americans. But there's no question that they firmly believed what they believed. And I take that as a lesson for a whole bunch of Republican senators now, where I think there's no question that more than a few of them firmly believe the filibuster's in their interest.
Well, I was just assuming that if the Republicans had the situation where there was no longer the 60-vote threshold, they would have been able to push through some pretty noxious stuff by now, right, along with Save America Act.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that they would make this particular bill their priority. It's pretty clear that, for example, they want a tax on reproductive freedom, or at least the public would demand restrictions on reproductive freedom. The public would demand a whole bunch of different action from the Senate, and the senators don't want to be pressed to take those votes, which is why they really like pointing to the excuse of the filibuster.
So you think that Senator Tillis is turning into something of a hero, because he's obviously not going to run again, but he's leading the fight on the Republican side, isn't he, to hold the line along with John Thune?
I am grateful to senators who have shown institutional spine. I wish that it had been earlier in coming. And I think it's regrettable that you find that spine most among people who were planning on retiring from Congress. It'd be nice if they found that spine when they had a continuing incentive to be in the body. But I'm grateful for it when it comes, wherever it comes from.
So let's then talk a little about your experience as the first White House senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights.
I think it's going great.
Tell us about it.
Well, it does shed light on the current moment. There was no shortage of frustration that I faced in that role, and continued to feel, in part because of the very real limits on what the president can do with respect to federal elections. So an enormous part of my job, and we knew this real well going in, was telling people what the president could not do constitutionally, legally, even by means of projecting power. We tried to close doors that should have been closed, and we tried to lock doors that should have been locked, and I think locked them less well than we should have. But the vast majority of my time was not spent on the rules of how elections should work outside of the legislative process. I worked quite a bit on that legislation we just talked about in 2022. Came 2 votes from passing, would have been, I think, an enormous step forward, not just in revitalizing the Voting Rights Act, but in revitalizing the system of elections that we've got. I am enormously proud that we did get legislation through to change the way the Electoral College works, at least on the margins, to make it a little more secure, to try to head off a future January 6th. The Electoral Count Reform Act passed in December of 22, and I think made a real big difference in the stability of the process going forward. But most of what we did when I was in the White House wasn't focused on the mechanics of elections, even if a fair amount of that time was spent on legislation, because the president has very little power on his own to affect the election process. We spent an awful lot of time on long-term social conditions of democracy and how to shore it up longer term. We still need an enormous amount of that work to be done. But I think that provides an important lesson for people today. The president professes to have a role in deciding how elections work in this country that he just doesn't have. And by that, I mean, Not that there are legal constraints on his ability. There are. But it's more important than that. We're used to the president blowing through legal constraints when he's got operational control. Right? There are legal constraints on the use of the military. There are legal constraints on the use of ICE forces. There are legal constraints on what you can do with tariffs. But he's got operational control on those three things. And that means that he can do things that require the courts to step in later. With respect to elections, he doesn't have operational control. And that's really important. So this isn't, when I say he doesn't have the power to impact federal elections directly, I don't mean it's not legal for him to do it. I mean, there's no button he can push. He needs to persuade other people, and by and large, the other people he needs to persuade just aren't listening.
Well, clearly the states control elections, and that was how the 13 colonies insisted on that right in order to join the Union. So that was like issue number one in terms of the American Revolution. But that hasn't stopped the states now from getting involved in their version of the Save America Act, right? And how
there are some.
Yeah, we got Florida and a bunch of others now. And there's bills in Arizona, Idaho, Iowa, Kentucky, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Utah, and West Virginia. So will Trump get his way, even if he can't do it federally? Will he get his way via the states?
I don't think so. There'll be some states that get in line. You point to Florida, and that may be an example. I think that Florida is going to find out that what they're doing is, as mentioned, hurts Republican voters, and I wonder if they're not going to change course afterward. There's an axiom of politics that says that if you change the rules by which elections are held, the people you affect most are infrequent voters and voters who are lower on the socioeconomic scale. People who vote all the time have a little more resilience in dealing with changes to the process. But people for whom the process is relatively new or relatively infrequent get caught up more in changes. And that's true across time, it's true across party, it's true however. I think a lot of current officials have a knee-jerk stereotype that infrequent voters tend to be urban Democrats. I'm not sure that was ever true, predominantly, but whether that was ever true or not, there's one feature of the Trump presidency that is undeniable, and that is he's brought immense numbers of infrequent voters who also happen to be lower on the socioeconomic scale to the Republican Party. So when Republicans change the conditions of voting, they're really shooting their own voters shooting them in the foot or shooting them in the face, depending on how severe the restrictions are. And that's part of why I think you'll see more of these bills filed than you'll see the bills passed, because most Republicans know that and don't want to screw with their own voters who put them in office.
And Trump's taken it further than the Save America Act because he's now wanting to get rid of mail-in ballots altogether.
He wants to and he doesn't want to, depending on the day. And this is part of what it means to be in an extremely fickle presidency when the president doesn't know what he wants. Yes, he said that. He said that repeatedly. He's also backed off it repeatedly. The president himself has voted by mail perfectly securely several times. And if you listen, his rhetoric on this has gotten a lot less consistent since 2020, when I think his raging against mail-in votes cost him the election because it dissuaded his own voters from voting by mail in the middle of a pandemic when voting by mail was the safest way to cast a vote. So on some days, yes, you're absolutely right. He rails against mail-in ballots. On other days, he encourages people to vote by mail. And I think that depends on who's been in his ear last. When his campaign consultants are talking to him last, I don't have an inside view on this, but I think they're letting him know, Mr. President, you're killing us with your own voters when you're trying to get people not to vote how they've found it convenient for years.
So just in the last few minutes then, Justin, I'm feeling a lot better thanks to this interview, because I fear this. I know what's happening in the Gulf. It's just hideous. Mm-hmm. And I'm astounded that this man got reelected after what a catastrophe his first term was, because he really the biggest challenge he had as the leader of this country was COVID, and he completely, through magical thinking, denied that was happening. And the same thing is happening in this war on Iran, where he's denying the reality of the Straits of Hormuz, for example. So this is a dangerously deluded man, but he's clever like a fox, and he tried a coup back on January the 6th, and he's conditioned a lot of people in this country to believe that elections are rigged, etc., and that 5 million Mexicans voted even in 2016. So he's put all that stuff out there and muddied the waters. But what you're telling us is that the Save America Act is not going to happen, and that means that the predictions in the polls of the Democrats sweeping, because, not all Americans are blind to what's staring them in the face. Can I rest assured here of a little comfort that there won't be a coup? It won't be the end of American democracy in November. In fact, it may well be the renewal of American democracy in November.
I think there's plenty of reason for that, and I think it comes down to us. You are absolutely right that the president is projecting noise into the environment. It's tremendously noisy right now. He is also trying to project power that he does not have in order to convince us that he's a magical creature and can just do his bidding. And if we don't buy it, then we'll be able to exercise our choice this fall about who we want to vote. I think for the vast majority of Americans, the conditions at the polls this fall are going to feel a whole lot like 24 and 22. I hope not like 2020. I hope another pandemic's not coming, but 2018 and 2016 and 2014, I think the process is going to be as smooth as people have experienced in the past. But whether that works or not depends on us deciding what not to listen to, us deciding to screen out the noise. We have agency here. And if we choose to use it, I think that we are going to get the government that we ask for this fall. Yeah.
Well, Justin Levitt, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Ian.
Well, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Justin. And again, I've been speaking with Justin Levitt, who's a professor of law at Loyola Marymount University and a nationally recognized scholar of constitutional law and the law of democracy. He recently served as the White House's first senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights, where he assisted President Biden to restore trust in a democracy. He previously served in the federal government as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, and has been invited to testify before committees of the U.S. House and Senate and the U.S. Civil Rights Commission and several state legislative bodies and both federal and state courts. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.